Level 1 of Charm takes place in a metropolitan city and current home of the main character, Felicity. We begin with a cutscene of Felicity expressing the frustration of her mother seemingly abandoning her while on her way home from school. The story kicks off in the form of a tutorial, allowing players to familiarize themselves with the core mechanics and grow in tandem with the story. As the player progresses, they find themselves entering a familiar city that's been terrorized and desolated by an unknown entity. Players must rid the city of invasive monsters, find the source of destruction, and uncover the secret behind Felicity's mother's disappearance. Working on Charmed was my largest challenge to date, both in terms of task load and time management. We were down 5 people compared to the other groups in my cohort, but we were still expected to produce at the same level. To aid my team in making this feat possible, I assisted in every department, on top of my role as creative director and design lead. My contributions include the tutorial zone, 9 out of the 13 level 1 tiles from concept to final iteration, mesh replacements, set dressing, final lighting, and foliage painting of level 1 in its entirety. I also handled all level events, level streaming, spatialized ambient sound effects, cinematics, and enemy encounter design across all levels. When my programmer was struggling with AI, I took over the programming of the snake enemy's pathing, detection, attacks, decision tree, sound effects, and animation implementation. To help meet tight deadlines on deliverables, I also took on the programming of gameplay mechanics including the Cataclysm ability, the player role, double jump, and the unique charm kick damage and visual effects design, the combo system, and associated animation implementation, and the dialogue system. I also filled the role of sound designer for all ambient, combat, movement, and enemy sound effects. To ease the workload on my single animator, I reserved and directed a mocap session to capture all player and enemy movement and combat animations. When designing, I had to keep the unique abilities of each charm in mind. By default, the player has a roll that allows them to overlap enemies and get out of dodge if they're ever overwhelmed. The Venom charm allows players to quickly dash in line and do single target damage to the enemy hit at the end of the range. Venom's ability, Strangle, allows players to latch on and pull themselves to a single target, dealing damage on connect and upon reaching the enemy. It's great for picking off weaker, hard-to-reach enemies and getting out of dodge. The Cloud charm allows the player to double jump, and when charged, shoot a chain lightning bolt that strikes up to 3 nearby enemies. Lastly, the Cataclysm charm prevents rolling while equipped, but in exchange contributes a damage modifier to all successful heavy combos. At 10 fragments, Cataclysm Slam can be cast, unleashing a devastating area of effect shockwave that knocks up and damages enemies in range. Given all of these player mechanics, it was important players have a fairly low obstacle space to be able to learn their mobility potential in a frustration-free way. In level 1, the primary enemy you face is the snake. These snakes are quick, with short attack cooldowns. If you attempt to run, not only will they chase you, but will also opt to use their ranged spit attack. All enemies have 3 tiers in which their health, size, and damage is increased. The farther you progress, the higher the tiers you face. The target skill level of players of Charmed is those who are familiar with games and have played a handful of casual, combat-oriented games, but are by no means required to be hardcore gamers. The target age range is about 8 to 14. Charmed was intended to be a low-stress fantasy beat-em-up, but in testing it proved that the theming caused heightened tension, and the hoarding tendency of the bipedal enemy made the experience a bit more stressful for some players. From the beginning, the mission was to deliver a power fantasy. However, my spin on it was more of a dark, grounded, and challenging fantastical experience. The goal was more empowerment through fantastical trials. It was critical to me that I deliver a real, memorable story backed by relatable emotions, especially for the target demographic. Doing so in an environment that wasn't the happy, bright fantasy world you would expect the main character to occupy just made sense. To really sell the fantastical chaos that had fallen upon the world, I created easily customizable blueprints for making any prop in the world float to a specified height and either stay suspended while floating, reset, or drop. Settings were also available for cars to enable headlights and honking, which allowed cars to be used to illuminate the gameplay space in a more dynamic way. The use of the floater blueprint really helped me breathe a little bit more life and chaos into a city already in disarray. I am, and will always be, an aesthetics person. However, with only one environmental artist responsible for creating all of the game assets, I emphasized utilizing light, post-processing, and more low-cost props to do the aesthetic heavy lifting. I opted for a contrasting color palette that was unsettling, conveyed conflict, and really drove home the idea that something had gone very wrong. It was my hope to be able to implement more spatialized ambient sound effects, environmental lights in combat zones that actually reacted to player damage, and more reactive world events to make the player experience feel more dynamic. Unfortunately, we were met with tight deadlines and had to move it to the Hopes and Dreams task board.